good?
I don't care. Yeah.
Why don't you start?
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us after lunch. We have our session here called Pass Out of a World of Cumulative Effects.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to run us through who we'll be hearing from today and the flow of the next 75 minutes together. So John and I will be co-hosting. John's my wonderful supervisor. I'm one of his master's students at Simon Fraser University at the Salmon Watersheds Lab. And we will be hearing from all these folks behind me. We're actually going to be starting off with Marta, who is one of our PhD students, another lovely member of our lab. We'll then be hearing from Bruce, who is from the West Moberly First Nations, Lisa from the province of BC, and Oliver Brandis from Polis at UVic. We will then have a Q&A. A Slido will pop up for you to submit questions. John and I will be moderating those as they come in. And then we'll have a brief creative Slido exercise at the end for all of us. Okay.
So as we know, cumulative effects are one of these sort of wicked problems that salmon really are challenged by. I think, if we step back and ask about, what are the key problems that we're wrestling with? I think the key problem is there's not one single problem. It's a death by 1,000 cuts, right? There's no smoking gun. This is what reports keep on finding. And so as salmon migrate, their migrations connect people, but they also connect different harms. And so as people that care about salmon, how do we really think about and then take action towards addressing the cumulative harm posed by the different things we do and ask of salmon? So I'm really excited about this conversation we're going to have today. We have some amazing thought leaders coming together for a conversation, and of course, amazing thought leaders in the audience as well. So what we're going to do to start with is some audience engagement. And so get your little phones out, and or big phones, I don't know. And I want to have you all share a story of harm. And I want you to think about one time when you witnessed something and you're like, wow, that's not good for salmon or salmon habitat. I think we all probably have many of those stories, but I want you to share that story. And it's going to have a 3-part question. The first question is, what was the activity that was causing the harm? The second is, what's the second, Emma? Oh yeah, how is the habitat harmed? And the third is, what part of the life cycle was impacted? And so if you go to Slido, you'll have a few words for each of those prompts, and then we'll share some of those stories of harm. And maybe look up and make eye contact when you've finished. Okay, so the first question is, what was the activity or industry that was causing harm? And what we see, if you pop up the Slido, is some different activities popping up. We have aquaculture, we have forestry, we have mining, we have clear-cut logging, we have oil spills, runoff, all these different things that happen in salmon systems that are causing harm. All right, and the second prompt, what did we see for that one from Slido? All right, and if we pop up the things that are popping up on Slido, We have all sorts of habitats and ecosystems being harmed. We have rivers, tidal marshes, estuaries, water and water flows, hydrology, riparian, wetlands, spawning grounds. So again, across the salmon life cycle, these different activities are harming the places that salmon need. Okay, and then the next prompt is what part of the salmon life cycle is being impacted. All right, and if we share some of those Slido results, what we see is the whole life cycle. Some people actually said the whole life cycle. Fry, spawners, juveniles, rearing juveniles, out-migrating, egg and fry. So again, we do have this sort of whole life cycle harms being witnessed by people in the room. I just want to take a moment and sort of acknowledge that, right? Like, this is the problem that we're talking about. Just within this room, we have this sort of collective of stories where we're not doing a great job of taking care of habitat. Different habitats across the cycle of life. Thank you for sharing those. Okay, so I think that's the motivator, right? We're trying to get from this sort of problem space into paths forward. How do we move from this myriad of pressures, this myriad of harms, into a place out of that? So we sort of framed up these three questions for the conversation. What are the key issues in understanding the risks posed by cumulative effects? What are the barriers? And what are the emerging opportunities and paths forward? And so we're really hoping to move this into the paths forward space today, but do acknowledge that this is a really hard issue. And we probably won't solve it this afternoon, but maybe these conversations will be productive. Okay, so for the roadmap for the next 75 minutes, actually 67 minutes and 36 seconds, according to the clock. We just went through the audience participation, initial part of that. We then have the panelists' presentations, and then we'll have opportunities for questions from the audience posted via Slido, and then there'll be this sort of Q&A that the panelists will host the questions from the engaged audience. All right.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to call Marta up to the stage. Marta's going to kick us off today. So as I mentioned, Marta is a PhD candidate at the Salmon Watersheds Lab at SFU, and she will be speaking to the key issues in understanding and the governance of cumulative effects.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session. I'm really excited to give an introductory talk on the problem of cumulative effects from a couple of different perspectives. And I'm really grateful to my co-authors, John, Nigel, Sam, and Spencer, and we've all been doing work on this topic associated with the Watershed Futures Initiative. So I'm going to be talking about our collective work throughout this presentation. So the reason that we're all here at a conference about BC salmon recovery and resilience is because, well, we all know that salmon are not doing very well. From this figure, from Walter's paper in 2019, we can see that BC Pacific salmon fisheries collapsed in the 1990s and they've yet to recover. And declines in Pacific salmon have had devastating impacts on economies, cultures, and food security in communities across BC as well as the Yukon. And population declines have led to this accounting of the state of salmon from Alaska all the way down to California. And there's a similar story emerging from all of these different regions. That is, there's really no smoking gun that we can point to that's causing declines in Pacific salmon, but rather it's a complex interplay of factors. This idea really starts to make sense when we look at the Pacific salmon life cycle, and as we saw from the answers that you gave on the Slido exercise. When salmon are incubating in fresh water and rearing as juveniles, they're facing all of these different stressors from human activities, from forestry, agriculture, urban development, mining. But then as they migrate down into estuaries and nearshore environments, they're facing stressors from salmon farms and other activities like ports and changes to habitat, as well as increasing predators. Then when they're in the ocean, they're facing even more stressors. They don't catch a break there either. They're facing so many impacts of climate change and changes in distribution of food and predators, as well as competition from hatchery fish. Then they have to make it back through so many different fisheries to come back to the streams that they were born in and face all the same stressors that they faced when they were juveniles. And so all these activities impact salmon and salmon habitat through this pathway of effects, where indirect impacts can change habitat conditions and negatively affect salmon. So one pathway may not have a huge impact on salmon on its own, but when you repeat that over time and space, or with other activities that occur in the same region, those cumulative effects of these activities really add up. However, cumulative effects, we can't think about them in isolation. Those effects don't begin with activities themselves, but rather the Crown laws and policies that enable them. We can probably all agree that salmon habitat has been transformed over the past 150 years, and this has likely played a huge part in the state of salmon today. So it begs the question, what are the impacts of activities on salmon, and is there a different way to govern these lands and waters to protect salmon and all they do for people and ecosystems? So where do we begin? One step might be looking at the pathways of effects themselves and seeing how activities connect to salmon. And Sam Wilson has been leading a massive literature review to bring in all of the scientific literature and studies that have been done looking at exactly that, connecting activities to salmon. And this is just one example from that work, looking at the connections of forestry to egg survival. We can see that forestry impacts this life stage in different ways. So this is one way to synthesize a general understanding of these relationships across a large geographic range. Another way of seeing these pathways of effects can be represented by this artwork, Cycle of Life by Joshua Watts, which represents specifically the Cumulative interpretation of ecological risks to salmon. And this art was just one outcome of collaborative work that Nigel did with Cumulative First Nation. And it brought both Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledge together to understand the pathways of effects harming salmon and other life in their territory. And in this artwork, the salmon head represents different salmon that have succumbed to different stressors. So on the bottom, we have a salmon that succumbed to aggregate in the streams from forestry, or from sea lice, from salmon farms, from commercial or recreational fishing. And though it's shown last out of all the factors that affect wild salmon, climate change has the widest reaching impact, affecting all stages of life and environments. So all of these different watersheds across BC with salmon, they are facing these different stressors and pressures. And to understand how these stressors are distributed across the landscape, Spencer has been looking at how these stressors occur and overlap spatially. And he's found that although every region faces cumulative effects, each has unique challenges, and some are more disturbed than others. And that also means that some may have different solution spaces as well. For example, in Vancouver Island, coastal forestry is a major stressor that salmon are facing, whereas in the interior, there's multiple major stressors from forestry, agriculture, devastating impacts from wildfires and mountain pine beetle. And then if you go north, watersheds in the mountainous regions are going to be facing very big shifts from snow-dominated watersheds to rain-dominated watersheds, which can impact salmon habitat in a lot of different ways. But if we bring all of this information together on understanding risks of activities to salmon and the pathways of effects, and how they're distributed across the landscape, it really doesn't make a difference unless that connects to the governance systems that regulate those activities. And this is often not the case in practice. Part of the issue is the complex landscape of Crown laws and policies that regulate activities that impact salmon, which is demonstrated by this rather chaotic figure. So there's a lot of different things going on here. So this shows just a number of activities that are going on in the province of BC and a few key laws that are connected to regulating those activities. And it's important to know that with each of these different sectors and their associated laws that span municipal to international jurisdictions, there's also multiple siloed regulatory bodies. And this type of structure can really enable decision-making that favors project-by-project approval rather than holistic stewardship of ecosystems. Through our work at Watershed Futures Initiative, it can be kind of discouraging to see all of the ways that human activities impact salmon systems and how our systems and Crown governance often fail to effectively manage these stressors, especially when these impacts are echoed in the places that we work, like in this stream here, Clapperton Creek in the Nicola River Basin. But with the problem of cumulative effects maybe comes an opportunity because it really forces us to think about salmon systems more holistically and to think about it in a broader way. So I'm really excited for the next talks after my presentation because there's so many ways that people are trying to tackle this problem of cumulative effects and trying to see this problem more clearly, but also find pathways out of a world of cumulative effects. Thank you.
Thanks, Marta. So coming up next is Bruce Muir. He's the Senior Environmental Planner with West Moberly First Nations, and Bruce will be speaking to the on-the-ground reality, sharing lessons not from salmon, but from caribou in Northeast BC, and the recent Yahe decision of 2021.
La Luise, Watsi, Ga, Bruce. And that's West Moberly First Nation. So my name's Bruce. I work at West Moberly. My family's at West Moberly First Nations. You can call me Watsi, which means caribou. That's my traditional name, or Ga, which is rabbit. But I also answer to the Cree, Wapoos, or even in Farsi, Hargouche. So what I'm going to talk about today is where I come from, where we deal with cum effects. This is not salmon. One part of the province doesn't have salmon. We do have kokanee now, because BC decided to transplant them into our watersheds as well. So most of what I'm going to talk about today relates to non-fish bearing issues or non-fish issues, but I think there's a direct link, especially some of the stuff you saw earlier, what we go through and what the rest of the province, including areas with salmon too. I'll talk a little bit about the context that where I'm from. I'll talk about the Yahe decision in terms of how it relates back to impact assessment. I'll show you two quick examples for cum effects management issues, and then a quick conclusion. This is the white moose. This is a spiritual animal to us, the white ones. People shoot these. One of those cum effects that nobody likes talking about or nobody even knows about. There's certain things, there's certain rules we have, ways of life. You'll hear that quite often through this presentation. Caribou fell into a coal pit. One of the last ones. Buffalo stuck under a well site. Had to be put down. Our predator-prey relationships are really out of whack. For decades, First Nations up north have been talking to BC about this, and for decades they were ignored. Finally, they started listening, but it was only after some of the non-Indigenous people started showing pictures and talking about this issue with the wolves. Now, when I bring up wolves, I'll be clear, our community has always trapped wolves, hunted wolves. They're central to our creation story. We do not cull wolves. There's a big difference. What BC does is not what we do. So caribou eating contaminated soil for oil and gas. Here, we've always battled issues with colonialism embedded within scientific reports and thinking. That caribou doesn't exist. It's in low elevation where BC doesn't like to talk about caribou because that's where oil and gas goes. That's where forestry goes. They don't want to deal with this. Dashinita, Asba, forest goat. They don't exist either according to BC. Our species are disappearing. We talk a lot about caribou, but also with our moose. What you see there is, these are based on BC's own studies in one of our regions within our territory. It's a 60% decline. But according to BC, it's stable or it's increasing. These euphemisms that are used to mischaracterize the cumulative effects in the past, what has occurred, are being used to justify development going forward. Climate change. So the little black line there, you can see that's the outline of Treaty 8 that BC overlaps. And on the left, you can see moving to the right, that green coming in. That's that hemlock ecosystem. We don't have that in our territory. We don't even know what that tree is. We have no words for that. But that's what's the climate that is already here and how it's going to change. And we can see the purple disappearing, those key areas for caribou up in the mountains, or big spruce. That black, in case you're wondering, the professor and researchers don't know what that is. That's an ecosystem that's yet to be defined. That's pretty much the boreal forest. Clear-cut logging. On the left, you see our traps in old-growth spruce forest. On the right, when I went back out to check on it, that's a clear cut. They even took the tops of the trees where our traps are. They couldn't even leave those two trees. Behind there was a spring. At that spring, every species came to it. We had a little camera set up nice and low. Even a baby grizzly that was probably just came out of the den walked up and gave the camera, and looked like he was giving it a kiss. It's all gone. We even have the people who did the cruising for the cut block. They're on camera. And our camera went missing too. Talk a little bit about the impact assessment points out of it. This is something I've struggled with internally, us talking about it, because it's often looked at as a court case, but there's key things you can pull out of that. I cannot see that screen. That's too small, like the notes. Yeah, it's like this big. Okay, that's better. Thank you. So we pulled this out of the court case, and when you look at, this is now the system for environmental governance and decision-making that is broadly across the world. You have your policy, which is your law, regulations, your plan, your program. Program is like economic incentives as well, and the project level. Impact assessment is often looked at as kind of the Environment Assessment Office, or what is it, the Federal Impact Assessment Agency now. But a lot of decisions are made down to the permitting, the licenses, and everything else. For oil and gas, for example, over 1,000 decisions are made every year in our area, in that one industry alone. So there's a lot of impact assessment that occurs or ought to occur at that level. And when you look at that case, BC's entire system was ineffective. It completely breaks down. From the top where rights are not properly included or included at all in laws, all the way down to cumulative effects just isn't really incorporated into the actual decisions themselves. Key thing out of the case, we often hear BC, tell us about your value components. It's a trick in a way. What matters is how you define them, how you're going to measure the change to these things. Here's where I usually tell most people in the community, we don't care about moose, we don't care about caribou. We care about caribou hunting, moose hunting, stories about moose, their medicines. Whenever things are defined as just the species-centric approach, we're left out. And often we see no impact to moose, therefore no impact to treaty rights, no impact to the people. yet we lost 60% of our moose. It's important for this when you start getting into actually understanding causality. And I'll show a diagram in a little bit about that. That's a moose lick you see at the bottom, or moose and caribou, I should say. Wherever you see that green grass, that used to be all the lick. In my years, just in 20 years, that's what it's turned into. Key point, the reference point. You often see BC not like talking about this, like talking about current conditions. It's not the present condition 99% of the time. Right? We talk about cultural baseline or a relational baseline. Relational, what I mean by that is like if you have a treaty or land claim that sets out what the reference point would be for measuring impacts. Very important when you talk about Indigenous culture and rights is this part. When this isn't done right, we have a huge problem. Most impact assessments the British Columbia government does, the house of cards can be topped over by examining whether they looked at the past impacts and future. That's where most impact assessments fail. So this I want to touch a little bit on the models. So you have stressor-based. This is like a zone of influence when you, say, add a 500-meter buffer around a cup block to account for those indirect effects, say, for a species, for like caribou. Effects level is looking at the selenium in the water. So the stuff that the mine produces gets into the water, eventually goes from the water into the fish-bearing stream, and they end up with slimy sculpins, little guys with crooked spine. That's at effects level. Too often, one is done without the other, or they're mixed together. Mixing them isn't a bad thing, but when you only focus on the landscape, saying, First Nations, you're fine, look at your land. Everything looks pretty good. But their culture camps are wrecked. Their hunting areas are wrecked. Getting back into something outside of just looking at landscape is extremely important. First Nations are not a species. And that's how they're looked at in a lot of assessments. It's as simple as that. You're not assessing and managing broadly, right? That's that landscape level thing. Where their places are, where they are really does matter. You can add a buffer around a cabin, and you're going to kill their culture. The cabin is there for more than just being there. This is when you start looking at the spatiotemporal traits of these places, the interconnectedness of these places. And I'm assuming, I'm not going to speak for Indigenous people that fish, but I'm assuming where they fish really matters. When matters. How matters. Who comes, who watches, where does the fish go afterwards? All of that, part of that thing are all these places. Indirect effects, this is where that causality comes in. Too often we look at first order, right? The direct effect, that's easy. The second and the third order, that's where you see a lot of effects that people miss. And here you start seeing the species-centric versus culture-centric. I don't know if everybody can see the figure I have there. But when you look at culture versus species and caribou, and you see different things come up. If you wanted to cum effects properly, and you did a species, look at all the culture stuff you keep out. And then what impacts that from forestry or other things. You cannot do cum effects properly if you exclude culture. Right? The purpose or function within a culture, that's right out of the case. You have to understand what that is and properly characterize these values, or else you're not going to be able to do cum effects assessment. Assessing meaning and significance. This is where the parameters, sometimes you see for cum effects assessment, you see the geographic extent, likelihood, frequency, the parameters for measuring significance, for example. Here, the way of life, the WL, has to be incorporated. What in the way of life can be brought in to understand the meaning or significance? Problem is, we just see the status quo continuing. BC's not changing anything, or they just avoid doing it. Mitigation follow-up is another one. A lot of times BC puts mitigations in. They're not binding, they're not enforced, they're ineffective. On the right, there's a mining operation that's supposed to be 6 meters wide, and it's over 14 meters wide. BC doesn't know this. They don't go back out and look. That violated the permit. And it wasn't just one road. It was every single one we went to and measured. Follow-up, the compliance monitoring. The follow-up is where BC's program right now falls on its face. This is where sustainability hits the road, and we're not doing it. And if we do a little bit, it's not very good. Those are cows standing in a mitigated wetland for western toad. Nobody knew there was a grazing tenure. BC forgot to check, the proponent forgot to check. They really liked our mitigation for the toads, though. We talk about outcomes. British Columbia brought us a data set saying, here's where we're protecting all the old growth. The old growth mitigates your cum effects. Does that look like an old growth patch in that red polygon? That's a clear cut. They mapped clear cuts, and not one. I took out the other 15 slides. They mapped roads. That's protected old growth inside that. And it wasn't cut after they delineated. That was cut before they drew that polygon. Endangered caribou. This is just last week. The red, those are past cut blocks. The little green dots, those are caribou. The lines, the caribou moving, the dot to dot. You can see that valley, how important it is for them to move across. The turquoise is where BC has or is about to approve more cut blocks. Did they assess the cum effects here? No. Are they managing caribou here? No. Did they acknowledge that caribou are endangered? No. Did they acknowledge they're already significantly impacted? No. That is where we are today, is this. These are two guys, a pair. Their nest was cut down during a Site C development. And they didn't go to the platforms that Hydro said are beautiful designs for them. Thus far, BC has disregarded legal requirements for impact assessment science. This is important. The court case was more than just saying you should do this. It was actually the proper application of the theory in the context of Indigenous people. They prioritize appearance over substance. Consultation is less and it's worse. I didn't think it could get worse. It can. It's politicized and they've dehumanized cum effects. They were asked a question once in Dawson Creek up north. A person asked a question about the social impacts, all the things that were happening from development and the people coming into their community. BC responded talking about habitat. That's not what the person asked. It's back to the species-centric, people out. To move forward, we started cumulative thinking, cumulative solutions. You think this would be obvious, but it's not. It's not being done. We have a small window to do things. The more we do in the land, the less options we have. Instead, we go to court, and proponents now argue that they're impacted by cumulative impacts. Too much protection. BC says in court, we didn't do anything in consultation. In this last case we were in, we demonstrated that grizzly bear, bull trout, elk, caribou, and moose, and fisher were all over cum effects thresholds. Didn't matter. BC didn't acknowledge any of it. One thing that's glaringly obvious is the lack of training with the province. They don't understand basic impact assessment, and they most certainly do not understand cum effects. That's across every single individual we work with. Start looking at fixing this problem, back to that one diagram, the flow chart. It's every single piece of that governance has to get tweaked. If you're just playing down at the bottom end, you're not going to fix the problem. You've got to go back, change the laws, not just focus on little management changes. That's a red herring when people are talking about management. That's a policy level. It's not going to create that effective change over time. Ujul Senla, thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I had the privilege of being on a Zoom call with Bruce to collaborate on my thesis, and I think we were meant to talk for just under an hour, and almost 3 hours later we hung up, so a wealth of knowledge. So next we're going to invite Lisa Helmer to the stage. Super excited to have her with us today. Lisa is the Executive Director of the Collaborative Stewardship and Cumulative Effects Management Branch for the province of BC.
Okay. Well, that's a tough act to follow, Bruce. The province, cumulative effects. Hi. So, just got to get my bearings here. So we've got notes, we've got slide, okay. Yeah, so thanks for having me. It's a privilege to join all of you today, and I am truly honored to be here to be a part of this conversation. And it's interesting, I truly owe my original kind of, my early learnings to Lillooet Nation. Growing up in Pemberton, one of my first jobs was working with Lillooet Nation, with Mount Currie Band. We got to assess every tributary in the Lillooet watershed. And it was Forest Renewal BC, it was the mid-90s, and I just ran into Edith, I don't know if she's in the room here, she hired me for that project, and I was the only non-Indigenous person on the crew of 25, and we spent the summer assessing every tributary to the Lillooet watershed, and that experience, you know, I was such a sponge learning their traditional names for plants and for the species and for the watersheds themselves. And the knowledge that they were so openly sharing with me, I didn't realize at the time, like, and we weren't calling it things, we weren't calling it TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, or Indigenous knowledge, and I wasn't Western science, it was just us working together in the field. But those early learnings really gave me some optimism that we can do this together without naming it anything or calling it anything, but being open to collaboration, and it's really given me the fearlessness I need to work in government and to make change from within, and to know that, as Bruce said, you know, BC needs training, BC needs learning in this regard. So it's a great job. It's scary. There's a lot of work to do, as you can hear, and I feel super honored to be doing that work and to be opening up this approach to cumulative effects for the province. So that's what I'll talk about a little bit here today. My slide deck is fairly dry, but I'm going to try to sort of riff off it and add in flavor and color where I can. So cumulative effects assessment provincially, the Environmental Assessment Office does the project-based assessments of projects on a suite of values. Like when a proposed project comes into an area and is proposing that work, the suite of values are assessed. In parallel, the cumulative effects framework is the values-based assessment work that looks at the cumulative impacts of all development on a particular value. So we can take the cumulative effects work and apply it to multiple proposed projects or proposed approaches. So a bit of a difference there, and I'll talk today about the CEF work. So what is the CEF? It's just a policy, right? It was written in 2016, endorsed by a bunch of ADMs and deputy ministers in government, and lo and behold, we had a policy. Before that, it was kind of spoken to through the Forest Practices Code and a variety of approaches, but never had the province articulated how it was going to think about cumulative effects. I remember writing a letter to the chairman of BC Hydro when I was about 18. I was watching a bunch of micro hydro projects being developed up and down the Sea to Sky, and I wrote him a letter and said, I think your policy is flawed. Like, what about those upstream invertebrates that aren't making it down to the salmon anymore because we're putting a penstock in there? And he never wrote back, but it gave me a sense of, oh my gosh, there's nothing in place here. And yet there are decisions being made every day. Hundreds of decisions across a number of statutes, and how are those decision makers taking into account cumulative effects? So we've come a long way since then, but we're not nearly far enough. So it's a policy. Near the end of my presentation, I'm going to get to something I'm really excited about, which is actually a legal order that's now in place to compel decision makers to take into account CE. So we have moved beyond the policy realm in one area of the province. But the goals are to support transparent and durable decisions, essentially. That word transparent is really important to me and to the work we do. The Yehi decision found that cumulative effects assessment and the decisions made were a total black box, right? That even Justice Burke couldn't really figure it out for good reason. So that was called in the decision and had huge implications province-wide. So that transparency piece is so important, and it's kind of why I took this position, was to kind of peel back the layers of that onion and really get in there and be like, how are we assessing cumulative effects? How is it truly being done? Can we explain it? Can we communicate it to others? And does it stand the muster test with our partner nations, with stakeholders, with industry? Is it logical? Cumulative effects assessments, monitoring, management can't be done by the province alone. It never could. I'd say the province has tried at various stages, but it's clear from the work that Bruce outlines, for example, and we hear from others that, of course, the province can't do this work alone. In 2015, well, I'll go back a little bit further. In about 2012, there were 9 pipelines proposed out to the coast from the upstream northeast out to the coast. And those proposed pipelines, we're not talking about shared corridors, we're not talking about shared disturbance. It could have been 9 separate pipelines out to the coast. We know that most of those didn't go through. There are a couple. But at that time, we talked to the nations in the north to say, how can we inform those decisions from a regional perspective? If those proposed pipelines are going to affect waterways, if they're going to affect any value that transcends administrative or any other kind of boundary, how can we manage those at the regional scale and inform those decisions from a strategic perspective? And so in 2015, we created these forums, these regional co-management tables, where BC and the First Nations came together to do the CE work, to assess the values, to develop the protocols, to redo the methodology, and eventually to inform those decisions. So we call that the Collaborative Indigenous Stewardship Framework. And there are now 13 forums across the province and about 150 nations involved. And it started in the Northeast, Skeena, Omineeka, and North Coast, and now is province-wide. And those forums, those co-management tables, are tasked with collecting the CE information together and feeding it up into decisions. The key there is that those valued components and that kind of language just doesn't fly anymore, right? And unless we can truly open that up and identify what other indicators matter to the nations, what cultural indicators matter. It is no longer just current condition, but cultural indicators and the perspectives of the communities on reliance of those indicators for cultural and ceremonial purposes that really matters. And then rolling that up into the decision, a whole bunch of work involved there around data governance, sovereignty, and respect, ownership, control, possession of that information. That's a topic for another day, I think even another breakout room right now. In any case, these forums are key to our collaboration, really key to the province being able to move forward and not do this work alone. But the framework has been underway. There are a lot of reports, there's a lot of web maps, there's a lot of products available to decision makers. It's pretty dry stuff, but when you think about the number of decisions being made every day, while we have these bigger, really important strategic conversations, like what does a decision maker today have in front of them in Fort St. John for a decision, or on the island? That's the work we do, is to make sure they have the scientifically robust data in front of them. We know that cumulative effects is best incorporated at the strategic level across the sector. We know that that is the best place to talk about planning and no-go areas and even Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and start to talk about setting aside entire regionally important areas from development. And that is the end goal and sort of what we're keeping our eyes on. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, decisions are being made. So a lot of cumulative effects information is informing permitting and authorizations today. And a lot of work goes on training those decision makers. Turns out statutory decision makers are not subject matter experts, right? Some of them are new to government or new to the process, and certainly new to resource management. So they need step-by-step instructions, guidance, support to do that work. We draw upon the forums, again, to have the nations train those decision makers where we can. So it's not just provincial staff training other provincial staff. We kind of open that up and broaden the scope there. I'm going to skip a few slides here, looking at the time. So the YEHI decision compelled decision makers to take into account cumulative effects information. So in September of this year, 2024, we put in place legal direction for decision makers to take cumulative effects into consideration. It's a legal order under the Environment and Land Use Act. It's in place till December 31st, 2026, and it applies to 12 pieces of legislation. So the Mines Act, Petroleum and Natural Gas Act, Forest and Range Practices Act, and it now compels decision makers to take CE information into account. The work we're trying to do behind the scenes is to make sure that that information is not just provincial CE reports and data, but is reflective of nations' way of life, Treaty 8 way of life in particular. So this order is specific to the Northeast District, and I think indicates where we may need to go, right, to truly legally compel decision makers. The cool part about this is that decision makers now have to pick up the phone and talk across the sectors to talk about sharing roads, for example, sharing linear features, shared crossings on streams. Never before has that happened. And you'll see pictures where there's adjacency issues, right? You'll see these huge right-of-ways where they could have minimized the road width and shared that linear disturbance. That's now happening under this order, which I think is incrementally heading in the right direction. So looking forward, we're continuing to refine and improve our products all the time, continuing to do that in collaboration with First Nations to provide that trusted, high-quality information. It really does take all of us. It takes academia, it takes nations, it takes stakeholders, it takes the province to work together to make sure that that robust set of information sets that is going to decision makers, those data sets, are trusted, right? And so that we can trust the subsequent decision that is made, which in some cases might be a no, right? In some cases, once we provide those robust data sets to decision makers, we'll see what kinds of decisions they can make. I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, we're going to move on to our last speaker before our Q&A with these panelists. Coming up next is Oliver Brandis from the Polis Project at the University of Victoria.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to let you in on a little dirty secret. I am not a fish guy. I'm a water guy, and even worse, I'm a governance guy. But the good news is I'm going to talk a little bit about the solutions part of it. And the solutions part is a little bit hard because sometimes it's a bit of fanciful thinking. And I'm going to start with a very simple premise. And the premise is that if we get our water right, we're going to get like 80% of the cumulative effects right, because water connects to kind of all the issues of the day. So there's the cumulative effects on the ground or in the water or in the watershed, but there's also sort of the bigger community, the prosperity, the quality of life, the reconciliations, the justice kind of component, the food security, the whole mix. And the way to begin to tackle this is to kind of look at it from a watershed security lens. So what is watershed security? It's not just a mandate in government. There's a lot of work that's gone into that before. And it's really that fundamental notion of the interconnected nature of all the things we've been talking about. And it puts it in a very specific way of thinking about it. There's a water quality and quantity component. There's, of course, the integrated and nested systems approach, the whole of watershed, the resilience emphasis, and then the piece that I'm super interested in, and the thing that I think will help us start thinking about the solutions, is the decisions and governance. So there's a very strong link, of course, to UNDRIP, but this clarity of roles. We've talked a little bit, or we've heard some of these themes about regulatory capture or the failure of the legal system. It's how do we begin to tackle that in sort of the today world? And the first piece is to think about governance. And I think, you know, we can do a whole technical discussion around this, and I'll save you that. Because we know that the public and communities intuitively understand what protecting watersheds has to do with. We know that expertise, science, traditional knowledge is going to be part of it. We know that there's got to be some rules, and if you're going to have rules, you got to have consequences. And we know that citizens and local control are going to be a big part of what we're dealing with. That's the planning piece. So really, in a simple way, it's not that hard, but now how do you put this all together? So we know in Canada, and certainly in much of the Western world, the who decides part of the problem is where it gets really hard. So certainly in British Columbia, we know that we have complex water governance. We know that at least the 4 levels of authority play a part, and how they intermingle in water, especially because of this powerful integrator, becomes a key part of it. So we need to rethink governance in this watershed context. So for some of you, this is dead obvious. For some, it's kind of like a new idea, right? Governance is more than government. Government is sort of those structures we're somewhat familiar with. Governance is this broader link, right, where those key actors, where civil society, First Nations, business, industry, community all play a role. Now, how do we do that exactly? Things like the formal and the informal structure really matters. And when we're talking about the kinds of issues we're talking about, the natural systems, scale matters. And the watershed is a really important scale because a lot of stuff happens and integrates at that scale. So the legislative, which I know a little bit about, and that's where I spend a lot of my time, but also the persuasive, the influence. How do we create this watershed culture? So there's a bunch of these pieces. And of course, the end game is this long-term sustainability. We start with watersheds where we integrate natural ecosystem into all aspects of decision-making. It isn't just one sector, one department, one ministry, but in fact a part of them all. So it's more than just pushing paper around. It starts with a process component, and then I'll do a little technical piece, and I'm going to probably run out of time. But I want to allude to some of the tools that we have available to us right now. Now, not well used. This is a big problem, and we'll talk about that. But the first piece is this process piece. And in a sort of post-UNDRIP world, we have to start with co-governance. And so what does that look like? Well, when you invite a lawyer to the stage, he's going to bring you pictures of laws and agreements. That's what this is. So you have to understand that the Crown Law is a general application where Indigenous legal orders and authority are place-based. So how do they intermingle? Well, right now in our system, you can see a whole bunch of different elements that come together, things like agreements, government-to-government agreements, there's provisions in different acts, there's constitutional provisions. That's how we do it. But fundamental to it is this concept of free, prior, informed consent. So that's how we begin to think about it differently. That's how and who is involved in those decisions and how that changes from the past system. Of course, a key element is this linkage between environmental flows, which is a broad concept, the kind of life pulse of a river, and that's where we link watershed health and Indigenous rights all in one place. Now, how do we do that? Here's a mix of the laws, the key Crown laws in the middle. I won't go through them all, but you want to put them in context because Indigenous water laws play a key part, as does UNDRIP. That's what begins to change from this sort of historical, regulatory captured Crown kind of system. Here are the sort of main areas, I'm going to call, the main tools in our toolbox that are available. Now, you can do this across any of the acts, and you could start anywhere, and we'd make improvements. But I'm bringing you the argument that it's really the water pieces where we should start. We have a new piece of legislation. We have 5 kinds of tools that are really critical in them. All of them, in different ways, address this kind of cumulative effects piece by getting the water piece right and forcing a whole bunch of the other pieces. The other analogy I like here is the spork all the way to the super advanced Swiss Army knife that can do everything. So there's some very simple provisions that we see some limited but beginning evidence of being used, things like environmental flow or critical flow and fish protection orders. These are short-term orders used to reduce or suspend water use, often in that kind of a drought setting or in those very acute problems. That's the spork, pretty simple. You move all the way from area-based regulations to things like water objectives, where you begin to influence how decision makers or what decision makers have to consider as they make decisions going forward, all the way to the much more advanced water sustainability plans, which are kind of like the Swiss Army knife, where you can do a whole bunch of stuff legally. Now, to most ecologists, this is pretty intuitive. This is where you begin to play a part where you take care of all the pieces. But for the, let's give those lawyers a bit of a break. They can't think that way. So integrating those various ideas in a legal sense takes some work, but we have that tool available to us now. One of the key ideas is the idea of moving from environmental flows versus critical flows, which is thriving versus surviving. And we see some provisions in the Act that allow that to happen, some positive changes. Now, the big concern, of course, is the pace of change. The problems are mounting faster than the laws are being deployed. It's a priority problem. The other really important piece is to think about how water gets allocated. So if you look at the top piece, that's the historical system. That's how the Crown has operated really for the last 100 years, which is to give out licenses until eventually they age. The human part is all that there is, and there's nothing left for the environment. And what we see in the Act is the potential to move towards the lower picture where we begin to keep an environmental component and the human piece is a smaller subset to be allocated based on social priorities and needs. And this, to me, this is the cool Swiss Army knife, right? This is the Water Sustainability Plan. And these are the kinds of provisions where you can change water entitlements, you link land and water, you start thinking about drought in context, you start thinking about those long-term and comprehensive approaches. It's about components that relate to dispute resolution, right? Because you're going to have to ongoingly make choices, make new trade-offs. Shared and delegated decisions. This is this integration of multiple authorities. And of course, you need to adapt over time. So this is a legal tool that is new that allows us to do this. But the hard work is done at that community level or that watershed scale where you have to kind of iteratively go through it. So, in my last minute or so, I'd like to just glance into the future, and I'm just going to emphasize that there's a bunch of drivers of change. These are all familiar to us. And I got some bad news. The bad news is the climate will never be better than it is now. Look outside the window. It only gets worse. So we have to start adapting all these forms, and water really becomes fundamental. So the future focus will be on this notion of security and resiliency, how we're adapting, and shifting the reality of who decides, right? More local control, more varied knowledge and understanding systems, traditional knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous laws, mixed with Crown and scientific pieces. And just a last thought to think about this. It's not a magic you might see in Lord of the Rings and Gandalf, but instead some kind of move from managing the watershed to managing people in the watershed. That's where we have to put our emphasis. And if we're going to tackle cumulative effects, we now have some of the legal and institutional tools, but we have to break the implementation gap and advance them in a much more rapid way. I think I'm close on time. Thank you.
Thank you again to all of our wonderful speakers. I'm going to invite you all up, Oprah style, onto the chairs up here and join John and I, and we'll have time for a quick Q&A. We will have a QR code up on the screen here for you all in a second, and we'll just be submitting questions via Slido and then moderating them up here. Come on up.
Yeah, if you guys could, will you leave these two open? Yeah, there we go. So first of all, let's give the speakers a round of applause, first of all. And I do want to really express my appreciation for you all to share your thoughts on this thing. This is a really hard issue, and so I think the fact that we're talking about it, first of all, is fantastic and a path forward. So could we share the Slido prompt so that the audience can post questions for us? So while we're doing that, I'm going to ask some questions if that's okay. So the first question is a sort of big one. And so as you sort of step back and listen to your co-hosts or co-Oprah guests or whatever we're doing here, what do you get excited about? Where is your sort of hope for moving forward with this? So I just want to, it's not that easy of a question. So let's just take a moment and think about that one, and then we'll go around the white couches. And so I will just point your attention up here. So there is this Slido, so you can post questions. We'll see those as those come in on Slido. You can also upweight questions that that you think are great. I don't think you can downweight questions, but we'll go in. Yeah, anyway.
Maybe I could jump in on the
Yeah,
hope
please.
question. Do I press the button? So you're hearing me okay? Okay, good. This hope question I think about a lot. You don't do this kind of work if you're either, a little bit daft or you are, deeply immersed in the concept of hope, because what else would you be thinking about? And the hope thing to me is stop reading the headlines, stop reading the international newspapers, go to place and see what people are doing. It's so grim when you look at the big picture. It's so optimistic when you go to communities in real places where they're talking about food security and restoring watersheds and bringing the salmon back. And so the connectivity to me is local. And so what we have to do is obviously scale it up and scale it out, but that local energy, local capacity where people are engaged in a real way, there's a whole lot of hope that resides there. So that's what gives me hope.
Thank you. Lisa.
Is my mic working? Yeah? What gives me hope? Was that the question?
Yeah.
I'd say I spent a lot of years listening, sitting and listening and witnessing really impactful conversations. And just in my various roles, just kind of at times being in total awe and almost shock of what I heard and thinking, that's never going to happen. And now here we are, and in my role, I'm now articulating those things I heard as a young biologist, and I'm seeing incremental change. And so that gives me hope that what used to be literally unspoken, you couldn't say, or if it was just behind closed doors, it's now out in the open, and we are incrementally making change. So that gives me hope that collectively we have the courage to kind of call the problem and work on solutions.
Bruce.
I don't know if hope is the right word for us.
Resolve.
No, it's not that either. It's more, how the elders would say, it's being connected to people and land. You don't need hope. That's what you need. And through that, you progress forward. Kind of what Oliver just said, it's hard to get through this stuff. But, the community members have been putting up with, cultural genocide and other things for, quite a long time. Even climate change, when I had to bring some of the science back and show them, it scared a lot of them. But then one elder said, oh, we'll get through it. We got through the last one. Right? They have stories about hunting mammoth. So, right, it brought them back to those stories and brought them back to the land and talking about things. So hope is not something I don't think I hold on to. I think we ground ourselves in this, and that gives us what others might call hope, I guess.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, I guess from a salmon science perspective, which is the world that I'm mostly in, I've been really privileged to be a part of a lot of really collaborative spaces in salmon science, and I think that's something that's really hopeful that, there's so many people that are talking to each other of this is what we're doing, you're working on something similar, how can we build on each other's work and help each other to really advance our understanding of these really difficult problems. So I think that's something that gives me a lot of hope.
Thanks, Marta. Okay, so we have our first question from the audience, and that is, how do we speed up this transformation? How do we speed up cumulative effects policies and their implementation, I'll add that, so that they happen in a timely manner? Who wants to tackle that one? Lisa, do you want to take a crack at it?
Sure. I'm looking at all these questions. I think I have to answer all of them. How do we speed up cumulative effects policies? If I could be so bold to suggest that it may not just be policies that we need to speed up, it's our general approach. I don't want to misconstrue the question there, but if I look at how do we speed up, how do we reduce cumulative impact faster, right? As I mentioned in my talk, a lot of decision makers haven't had the tools they've needed to make informed decisions. And so those decisions haven't been trusted. And when a decision is challenged or contested in court through a dispute resolution process, that really slows down the decision and often then goes back to the original informing policy or approach. And that can churn, definitely for a decade, that churn. And so collectively, if we can, as I mentioned earlier, if we can make sure that decision makers are provided with more robust information that is trusted, the intent would be that decisions are more trusted. But in addition, as Oliver mentioned, in the FPIC space of shared decision making, that's a whole area to take together, a step to take together as well, that may, just inherent in having different decision makers make decisions, they may make decisions that reflect a better, more comprehensive perspective on cumulative effects. So a government decision maker is going to make a different decision possibly than other decision makers.
Okay.
And maybe can I just jump in?
Please, yeah.
I'm going to really simplify it. There's 3 simple steps. You got to say no. So you need different authority, different decision makers. They got to say no. Sometimes they got to say no. You got to know what to fix. So that takes money. That's a priority thing. So which parts, and I'm not an ecologist, I have a bit of restoration background, but you got to know which pieces really matter, which wetlands really matter, which streams really matter, are going to get you best bang for the buck. And number 3, you have to actually shift the priorities. It can't be economics first. You have to show the value. There's a great line, right? Like, what if watersheds were part of our health system? We treat it different. So watersheds are part of our health system. Healthy watersheds, healthy fish, healthy people. So if we can make these kind of simple 3 shifts, know, priorities, and extend out the implications, right? I'm not saying we can get rid of all the jobs. We have to shift the jobs. We have to shift where we're getting our economic health and our prosperity from. So those 3 things.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to try to take a crack at synthesizing a few questions that are popped up, if that's okay. So one of the questions that's come out in a couple different forms is thinking not necessarily about the projects, but the underlying values of capitalism that might be driving these projects forward. Is there a way that we could be thinking about how we could be working towards shifting values and attitudes towards environmental stewardship that would then underpin these transformations? Bruce, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Might have to repeat that.
So I guess a couple questions have sort of raised the ideas of values, or what do people care about? And so what is the path forward in terms of shifting attitudes and shifting values such that it's not really prioritizing short-term resource extraction?
Well, the law that BC mentioned earlier, this new thing that they just created and how great it is, that resulted in all that caribou stuff I showed earlier. That law doesn't work. If I was grading that in an undergrad 4th year class, I'd fail the law. There's a mistake in it where there shouldn't be, where it says avoid and mitigate. Avoidance is a type of mitigation. The parameters that were put up, those are helped understand significance. Magnitude's not in there. All those things I said earlier that was missing, that's that new law. Having those effective laws and doing different things and how to push this envelope forward, I think goes back to people. Goes back to communities demanding it. What we see all the time. Don't care about caribou, don't care about utility rights. There must be a robust forest industry. That's the word, robust forest industry. It's about weight. The weight that's put on one thing that led to the cumulative effects problem. It's still being done. So the values are there, the people expressing them are still there, and they need to keep going. But unless there's leadership in government, which there is not, because that just happened 2 weeks ago, there's 50 caribou left. They're going to wipe them out. And so we're left with, well, our values are there. We express them. We wrote 2,000 pages once in one process in 2.5 months, and then the government said we didn't do anything. That's where we are, and that's where we have to keep pushing things. But those values, it's that weight that's put on it. That's, I guess, where it kind of sits, is they have to care. If nobody cares about these other values, then that robust economy keeps plugging away.
I could just add to that a slightly different angle, just around stewardship, caring about stewardship. We have seen a lot of interest in guardians and land-based monitoring and assessment work, where local community members get out on the land and monitor impact and monitor the current condition of the land base. And from that, we're starting to see prescriptions for restoration and the local economy and local trades and local skills contributing to that restoration effort. So I do see a space there where there could be a shift in a stewardship economy away from a resource extraction economy, being led by communities and being informed by field-based monitoring by guardians and other land-based monitors.
So we used our time very fast. We have 5 minutes left, and I just want to recognize that. So I'm just going to give the panelists a moment to just say a few wrap-up words. So give it some thought, just sort of a key moment, and again, thinking about paths forward. We're going to now transition to a last Slido for you as well. And again, that is going to be thinking about these paths forward. So if we could put the new Slido up, that'd be great. Okay, so what is one thing that you think holds promise for the effective management of cumulative effects? So we're going to go through, and the panelists are going to address that question, and your answers are coming up as well. All right. Marta, can you go first? Not to put you on the spot.
I think, one of the things that holds promise for effective management of cumulative effects, it's such a big problem. But I think just, the number of people that are here talking about cumulative effects today, if you just see how much more it is in the public eye, and scientists and all of these people that are working on salmon and care about salmon, it's just way more part of the conversation. So I think that's a really good step forward, but obviously there's so much more work to do to find some pathways forward for this problem.
Bruce.
I'm stuck on the word management, because how BC looks at management versus how, say, the cumulative effects science looks at management.
So you can chuck the word management.
No, it's fine. It's just, it's not just about this one little thing, but it's the broader picture, managing data. But before you even get there, you have to do the assessment. Before you get there, you have to have the baseline work done. All this stuff that has to happen before you start talking about, what if we make the decision to do something now? You can't do follow-up to see if your mitigation measures are effective. You haven't properly assessed the impacts. Those cows standing in the wetland. But first off, there was no follow-up on that project. That was me going out, following up on what we were trying to do and realizing, what are the cows doing here? So you have to have good assessment, good data. Those are key parts to now getting into, when you start looking at the management, going out looking at, are you effective at what you thought you were going to do in terms of reducing the impacts? Is it acceptable? Is that getting to the thing you're trying to do? And that's, I guess, the hard part, because there's a lot of those social decisions that have to be made of what is acceptable. Who makes that decision? Is it local, or is it Victoria? So that effective management part of it, I think, that is a key element of where we're just failing, but those failures start way before. They're not just happening afterwards. You can't reduce effects if you keep causing them. You can't manage them if you're not assessing them.
Thank you. I'll just point out that your name is one of the things that hold promise for the effective management of cumulative effects.
I'm not a solution, trust me.
Lisa.
holds promise for effective management of CE. I'd say measurement, right? Like you can't manage what you're not measuring. And for us to be talking about land-based monitoring and assessment of values to truly get a shared understanding of what the land base currently looks like, we can then make informed management decisions together. So in my mind, it's so important to have the right information, the right data. And I think back to best management practices and just the lean, very thin list of data sets that have been available in the past compared to where we are now. Information is power, right? And we can make better decisions with better information that is truly reflective of the people on the land. So I think it's all about measurement and our approach to monitoring and assessment so that we're informed in the way we manage.
I'm usually a pretty agreeable guy, but I'm going to have to disagree because measurement's not the problem. We know, people have known for 50 years, there's a problem. And they know that it's a cumulative problem. They maybe can't specify which piece, but we know there's a problem. So I'm going to go with the will of the people. I think they're not wrong because what you are saying, Bruce, we love you, Bruce, but Bruce represents the thing we're missing. It's the local control piece. It's the ability of people in place who care, who are checking on the road, who are following up, not because they looked at some data sheet that says, oh, there's a problem over there, because they actually have a connection to the place. And I think that that is the missing piece, and that's where the promise is. More and more communities, more and more localities are saying, we want to be involved. We're not just going to wait for the province or the feds to show up and fix it. They're not coming, folks. It's going to be the locals who have to sort it out, and we have to use those tools that the federal government or the provincial government make available. So there's consequences, but it's the locals. It's the Bruce in every single watershed that's going to make the difference. That's where we're going to get there.
Thanks. So I just want to thank you all for being a part of this. I was really excited about this conversation, and it's got, I think, a lot of us thinking of a lot of challenges and also mulling around these ideas of, well, what do we do about it? How do we move forward? And I don't think necessarily that we came up with the answer. Correct me if I'm wrong, besides Bruce. But I guess I will say that I think that there are a lot of bright spots out there, and I think the conversations that we started today hopefully will continue in the hallways, and hopefully will hope to continue to upweight this key challenge, and we can move it forward together. So thank you all very much. And I do invite us to continue these conversations. I'm sure the panelists would love to keep chatting, and let's keep it going. Thanks all.